Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
When a crime of massive scale is finally exposed, the question isn't just about criminal punishment, it's about financial justice.
Exactly.
How do you compensate hundreds of people for unimaginable trauma? And, how do you do it quickly without forcing them into a brutal legal fight?
That tension is really the central focus of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We are unpacking the Jeffrey Epstein Victims Compensation Program, the EVCP.
Right.
This fund was set up after Epstein's death, and it was held up as this model for a non-adversarial resolution. But
Right.
it very quickly got tangled in controversy.
A controversy over the cost of that. Specifically what victims had to give up in terms of public accountability.
That's the one.
So our sources for this deep dive are detailing the design, the outcomes, and all the sharp disagreements that really define the EVCP. Our mission is to understand how this thing worked as a kind of shortcut to being informed about this whole world of mass trauma compensation.
And we know the basics. It was voluntarily set up by the co-executors of Epstein's estate, announced back in November 2019, with the goal of being confidential, something outside of litigation.
And if you want to understand the architecture of this fund, you really have to look at the people behind it.
Oh, absolutely. This whole claims resolution model, it is entirely dependent on the credibility and the experience of its administrators. They're the ones who bring the template and, the trust required for victims to even consider opting out of a courtroom.
Okay, so let's unpack this claims team because their pedigree is just. It's central to the program's public image. It was led by Jordana H. Feldman, and she was partnered with Kenneth Feinberg and Camille Buros, who were brought in as consultants.
That's the A-team of mass compensation. Their presence was a very deliberate signal. Ken Feinberg is, he's globally recognized as the leading expert in this field.
Right. He and Buros were, at the same time, managing a claims fund for sexual abuse victims across something like 23 Catholic Church dioceses. They handle things on a massive, complex scale.
But the person with the day-to-day authority, the one praised for her empathy, was Jordana Feldman, or Jordy Feldman. And this is where the precedent for the EVCP really comes into focus.
It is. What's genuinely fascinating here is how Feldman connected this, a private fund, back to a huge government standard. She's a nationally recognized authority, a designer of these programs.
And she had this incredible history.
An incredible history. She was the Deputy Special Master of the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund, the VCF. And she was there for nearly a decade across its different versions.
So she wasn't just some legal consultant. She was instrumental in running maybe the most significant, most sensitive litigation alternative program in modern American history.
Yes. Compensating victims of 9/11 related exposure. She even co-authored the final report for that program.
So when victims looked at the EVCP, they were really seeing the shadow of the 9/11 fund. Exactly. A program designed not just to pay, but to provide dignity and a non-adversarial space. Feinberg himself praised Feldman for bringing, and I'm quoting here, a wealth of experience and a profound sense of empathy that gave the EVCP instant legitimacy.
So equipped with that trust, they make this powerful pitch to Epstein's victims. What was that promise specifically?
The promise was long overdue compensation, delivered through a process that was fair, prompt, and non-adversarial. It was sold as the only way to avoid the, years of protracted civil litigation that usually follow something like this.
Which can be so re-traumatizing for survivors. That desire to avoid a public courtroom battle is completely understandable. So what were the specific mechanics they put in place to ensure that?
Well, the whole mechanism was designed to empower the claimant. Participation was completely voluntary, and claimants kept their right to sue. They kept their leverage unless and until they accepted the final offer and signed a release.
And importantly, they could meet confidentially with Feldman to tell their story.
Yes, to provide all the intimate, detailed information for their claim. Advocates actually described it as a safe space. Clients could share these incredibly sensitive details knowing it was confidential, unrecorded.
Which is just a world away from facing an aggressive cross-examination in open court.
A world away.
Yeah.
And that focus on the process itself was key to Feldman's role. She publicly emphasized that she had complete autonomy, final decision-making authority.
So the estate couldn't just step in and say no.
She was adamant. The estate had no authority to modify or reject her decisions. That independence was a condition of her taking the job.
Okay, wait a minute. If the goal of the program, from the estate's point of view, is to limit its liability and costs, how truly independent could she be?
Yeah.
I mean, we know from the sources that Feinberg's firm was paid $1.7 million, and Feldman herself getting a salary of $150,000 a month. That money is coming directly from the estate she's supposed to be independent from.
And that is precisely the point that critics latched onto. While her professional reputation is, stellar, the sheer amount of money she receives from the estate, it raises legitimate questions about a structural conflict of interest.
It has to. She's being paid very, very well by the very entity that's trying to limit its financial exposure.
Exactly.
That's a vital piece of context. So, with that in mind, what were the final results? How many people actually applied?
The program ran for a year, from 2020 into mid-2021, and it received about 225 applications from victims here in the U.S. and abroad.
And that number was way higher than they expected, right?
Oh, yeah. More than double the initial estimates. Just an incredible number of women coming forward.
It just speaks volumes about the sheer scale of his crimes. So what was the financial conclusion of all this?
Of those who applied, roughly 150 were deemed eligible for compensation. And the acceptance rate for the offers was extremely high. Over 92% of women who got an offer took it.
Which suggests that speed was a huge factor for them.
A huge factor.
And the money. The total payout.
The total compensation paid out was over $121 million. Sometimes you see it quoted closer to $125 million. The awards themselves varied a lot, from low six figures up to over $1 million for some.
Okay, now let's go back to the source of that money, because this is where it gets tricky. Epstein's estate was initially valued at a staggering $635 million. So critics are constantly pointing out that $125 million is, a pretty small fraction of that initial wealth. Where did the rest of it go?
That context is crucial for understanding the criticism. The $635 million was the initial gross valuation. After that, the estate had massive operational costs, legal fees, taxes, other creditors.
Filling up the mansions and all that.
Exactly. So by mid-2021, after funding the program and paying all those bills, the estimated worth of what was left had dropped to about $190 million.
So even accounting for those costs, the estate still paid out significantly less than half of what it had. And this is where we hit the core conflict of the whole program. Because the compensation came with, well, a legal poison pill.
Precisely. This is the great trade-off. For the victims who accepted the money, they had to sign these incredibly broad releases.
And that was the whole point for the estate.
That was the ultimate goal, to foreclose their ability to bring any further claims against not just Epstein's assets, but against any of his former companies or employees, including those alleged to have conspired with him.
This sounds less like a compensation fund and more like a mass liability shield engineered by the estate.
In effect, that's exactly what it was. The sources document that this release meant women were explicitly required to drop civil claims against his alleged accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell, in at least 3 cases.
And it also protected the estate's own co-executors, right? Darren Indyke and Richard Kahn.
Yes. The same men who the U.S. Virgin Islands Attorney General had publicly called indispensable captains of Epstein's whole criminal enterprise.
So that's the central ethical problem. Victims were forced to trade their right to hold alleged conspirators accountable, including the guys managing the fund itself, for swift, confidential cash.
And the key loss here wasn't just the right to sue. It was the loss of legal discovery.
That's the most important distinction. In a lawsuit, a lawyer can force people like Maxwell or the co-executors to turn over documents, emails, and sit for sworn testimony.
Exactly. Discovery is how you unearth the full truth, the scope of the conspiracy, the enablers, the financial network that let it all happen. By taking the payout, victims sacrificed that powerful legal tool. They ensured the full truth stayed buried.
And given that trade-off, it's not surprising that critics found the payout to be insufficient. Lawyers like Lisa Bloom said the $125 million was just too small compared to the initial estate value.
She argued the awards just undervalue the true harm suffered, all in exchange for protecting this massive network of associates.
The cost of running the fund didn't help either.
No, it just heightened the scrutiny. I mean, paying experts is necessary, but the scale of those fees, Feldman's substantial monthly retainer, it all fueled the perception that the fund was highly beneficial to everyone involved except the victims who wanted full accountability.
And the human element of this, despite the promise of that safe space, it seems like it was deeply fractured when it came to transparency. Let's talk about the psychological impact of the denials.
This is maybe the most painful part of the sources. Claimants who were denied compensation or who got offers that felt, insultingly low had absolutely no recourse.
No appeal.
No appeal process. And most critically, they received no explanation for the decision.
Wow. I mean, imagine going through the emotional labor of sharing the most painful details of your life, only to get a letter that basically says, we've decided not to compensate you. Full stop. No reason why.
That psychological wound was profound. We know of one claimant, a former model, who talked about the immense anger and confusion after her denial. She felt this deep regret, as if the fund was publicly declaring, your story wasn't valid, we don't believe you.
The opaque nature of it just completely undermined the very validation the process was supposed to provide.
It did. It created a system where, even if most people accepted offers, the small percentage who were denied were essentially re-traumatized by it.
That's what some lawyers called the scattershot results.
Right. Now, Feldman stated decisions were based on the impact of the abuse and the credibility of the claims. And, to be fair, they specifically ignored things like the statute of limitations, which was a huge positive for claimants.
But without transparency.
Without transparency, victims were left agonizing. Was my memory flawed? Did the fact that I stayed in contact with him count against me? The closure offered was purely financial for some, and for others, it just wasn't there at all.
So what does this deep dive ultimately tell us about these kinds of private, non-adversarial compensation funds?
It confirms that the EVCP was a genuine attempt to apply a recognized successful model, the one Feldman helped build for the 9/11 VCF, to a massive criminal estate. But the success of that model is inherently compromised when the paymaster is the estate itself.
And when the primary mechanism for closure is a comprehensive litigation release.
The lesson is clear. While the system provided efficient compensation to 150 survivors, the core conflict is whether that process ultimately served the interests of the victims who needed closure or the alleged conspirators who needed that liability shield.
It's a mechanism that seems to fundamentally favor the estate by trading financial expediency for public truth.
That's the trade-off.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. The Epstein Victims Compensation Program required survivors to waive their right to sue alleged conspirators, thereby sacrificing the legal process of discovery. This raises a huge question for all future mass trauma resolutions. When is the immediate relief of confidential financial compensation worth the sacrifice of public accountability and the full, documented truth that litigation might have unearthed?
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.